Zahara Monroe knew the town of Windsor Creek like the back of her hand. The crooked paths, the magnolia trees that had stood for decades, the quiet streets that had watched so much go wrong, yet refused to say a word. But that evening, as the sun began to sink behind the broken horizon, something in the air felt different. Heavier. The kind of stillness that preceded a storm. Zahara wheeled herself along the cracked path, the wheelchair's creaky wheels keeping time with her thoughts. For 12 years, this chair had been her constant companion ever since the accident, one simple traffic stop gone wrong that left her bound to this seat. But she wasn't broken. Not in spirit. Her body might have failed her, but her mind was still sharp, still defiant. She could feel the tension before she saw him. The heavy thud of boots grinding against gravel. Deputy Travis Keene. Zahara had seen him around town enough to know he was trouble, the kind of man whose hatred wasn't just a belief but a tradition. He wasn't just any cop. He was a symbol of the dark side of Windsor Creek, the one no one talked about but everyone knew was there. He was broad-shouldered, his buzz cut almost military, and his eyes, dark and soulless, had a way of making you feel like he saw you as less than human. And tonight, there was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Well, look what rolled out of her hole today, Keene sneered, his voice thick with disdain as he stopped a few feet away, his shadow swallowing her. The insult felt like it should hurt more than it did, but Zahara had learned long ago to keep her head high, even when people like Keene tried to drag her down. "You're trespassing," he continued, eyes narrowing as he glared at her. "You people think the world owes you something. You never know when to stay in your place." Zahara didn't flinch. She had long since mastered the art of standing her ground, even when faced with cruelty. "This is a public park, deputy. I have as much right to be here as anyone else." Keene took a slow step forward, his boots scraping against the dirt, a sick smile curling on his lips. "Not anymore, you don't. There's a new rule. No unaccompanied invalids in the restricted areas. Town council passed it last month. Guess you didn't get the memo, huh?" She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, feeling the familiar weight of anger stir within her. She wasn't here to beg for permission. She was here because it was her right. "I've lived here my whole life. My family planted those magnolia trees. I don't need to be told where I belong by someone like you." Keene's face twisted in a way that reminded Zahara of a predator, stalking its prey. "Your people planted a lot of things. Cotton, tobacco, trouble." Zahara's eyes locked onto his, her voice steady despite the rising storm in her chest. "And resilience, deputy. You can't bury that. Not here." The park, once peaceful, now felt suffocating. Keene's presence seemed to block out the last rays of sunlight, leaving her in a shadow that felt darker than the evening sky. He stepped closer, so close she could smell the rancid tobacco on his breath. "You think you're untouchable, don't you, Monroe?" he growled, his hand reaching down toward her wheelchair. "Well, newsflash, lady. That chair doesn't make you immune to the law. And the law says you're not welcome here." The grip on her wheelchair tightened, and before Zahara could react, Keene twisted the chair, jerking her away from the sunlight and toward a narrow, forgotten path that led into the thick trees at the edge of the park. Her heart raced. This wasn't a simple confrontation anymore. This wasn't just words. This was something much darker. "Where are you taking me?" Zahara demanded, her voice sharp, but there was a knot of fear forming in her stomach. "Somewhere quiet," Keene muttered, his voice dripping with malice. "So we can talk about boundaries. You know, your kind never seems to get it." Zahara's mind raced, but her body remained still, too used to this kind of fight. She wouldn't give in, not now, not ever. She had survived worse. She could survive this. But as the wheels of her chair dragged through the dirt, she knew this was different. This wasn't just another cop harassing her in public. This was personal. And it was about to get a whole lot worse. The wheels of Zahara's chair sank deeper into the dirt as Keene dragged her toward the secluded corner of the park. The trees, thick and overgrown, seemed to close in around them, swallowing the world outside. The faint hum of the town seemed a lifetime away. There was no one to hear her, no one to intervene. Zahara's pulse quickened, her thoughts racing as she gripped the armrests tighter, her fingers almost white with the force. The fear in her stomach gnawed at her, but she refused to show it. Keen stopped at a patch of dirt, barren and forgotten. The tall, tangled grass was dying, and fallen branches lay scattered on the ground like the remnants of some past tragedy. His heavy boots crunched the earth beneath him as he turned to face her, an unsettling grin plastered on his face. His eyes gleamed with something darker, a cruel satisfaction that made Zahara's skin crawl. "You think you can talk back to me? You think your words mean something here?" Keen spat, the venom dripping from every syllable. He towered over her, his shadow spreading like a curse across her face. "The law says you're nothing, Monroe. You're a broken, disabled woman, and you should stay in your place." Her throat tightened, but Zahara swallowed the lump. She had faced worse than this. The insults, the hatred, they were all just noise to her. But the danger that lurked in Keen's eyes was something else entirely. She knew this wasn't just an argument anymore, it was a test. A test of how far he was willing to push, and how much she would endure before she broke. Zahara held her ground. "You don't scare me, deputy. You don't scare me, and you never will." Keen's smile faltered for a moment, but only briefly. He was a man who wore his cruelty like a badge, and Zahara knew that what he truly feared was losing control. But she wasn't here to let him win. Not now, not ever. "Do you know why I'm doing this?" Keen growled, his voice lowering. "You're all the same. You think you're entitled. But I'm just cleaning up a mess. The world doesn't need people like you. It never did." His hand shot out, grabbing her wheelchair roughly, spinning it in a wide arc. Zahara's breath caught in her chest as the chair teetered on the edge of tipping. She fought the panic that surged through her veins and braced herself. She wasn't going to let him break her. Not like this. But before she could react, Keen's grip tightened, and the wheelchair lurched forward, dragging her along the rough path. He was taking her deeper into the wilderness, away from prying eyes, and the silence of the woods made Zahara's heart beat louder in her ears. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. She had always feared this moment, feared the darkness that could overtake places like this. But it was something else that made her heart race faster than ever. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she could feel a cold certainty, a whisper of an old memory. It was the same feeling she had felt back at the traffic stop. The same feeling that had settled deep in her bones when everything went wrong. The sense that no matter what she did, the world might not care. That there would be no one to save her. Keen's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "I'm going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget," he sneered, his grip still tight on the chair. Her mind was in a whirl as he dragged her closer to the edge of the woods, each step more dangerous than the last. She had fought for so long, never giving an inch. But now, with the trees closing in and the weight of his words sinking deeper into her skin, Zahara felt a fleeting moment of doubt. It was a feeling she couldn't allow herself to entertain for too long. "Let me go, deputy," she said, her voice unwavering but firm. "You can't win. Not with your hate, not with your violence. I've survived worse than this." Keen only laughed, the sound empty and full of malice. "You think you've survived? No. You've just been hiding. Hiding behind your chair, behind your story. But tonight? Tonight, I bury you, Monroe. You won't be able to hide from me. Or anyone." He twisted the wheelchair further into the clearing, and Zahara's heart stopped for a beat. There was no turning back now. Keen had crossed the line, and she knew she was running out of time. But she wasn't going to beg. Not for him. Not for anyone. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She pressed the button hidden under her seat, the secret signal she had always kept close, just in case. The small, discreet device clicked on, sending out a pulse. A signal to the one person who could save her. 5 seconds. That's all it would take for Elijah to hear the call. 5 seconds until everything changed. Zahara didn't know if she would survive this, but one thing was certain, she would fight until the very end. And when Elijah came for her, he would find her broken, but unbowed. 5 seconds passed. It felt like a lifetime. Zahara's heart raced, her breath shallow as the cold dirt pressed against her skin. Her eyes stayed locked on Keen, whose sinister smile seemed to stretch wider with every word he spoke, like a snake preparing to strike. He didn't know yet, but she had called for help. She didn't know how long it would take, but Elijah would come. He had to. You think someone's coming for you? Keen scoffed, bending down to her level. His foul breath hit her face, thick with tobacco and hate. No one's coming, Monroe. No one cares about your kind. You're just another problem to bury, another corpse to forget. His hands gripped her arms, jerking her roughly toward him, his fingers digging into her skin with each movement. Zahara winced but didn't flinch. The pain didn't matter. She could endure it. She had endured so much worse. Let me go, she said through gritted teeth, her voice steady despite the tremor running through her. You'll regret this. Keen laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed through the empty park. Regret? No, lady. I don't regret a damn thing. This is justice. This is the law. The world doesn't need people like you stirring things up. I'm doing everyone a favor. His words felt like poison, but Zahara's mind stayed sharp, focused on one thing, survival. She wasn't going to let this man, this monster, define her, even if he thought he could break her spirit. He shoved her back in the chair, the force sending a jolt through her body. The wheels of her chair dug into the loose dirt, and she felt the cold press of the earth rising against her. She could feel him preparing something worse. Something that would take away her voice. But she refused to give him the satisfaction. She would fight. She had to. Zahara's mind raced, her pulse hammering in her chest. She thought of Elijah, her husband, her protector. Trained in ways Keen couldn't even imagine. Elijah had always known when to move, when to fight, when to stand still. She couldn't let him down now. She had been in worse situations, and she had survived. This wasn't the end. Suddenly, Keen's hands were on her again, lifting her roughly from the chair. The movement was quick, almost too fast to follow. His fingers dug into her sides as he hoisted her up, dragging her away from the wheelchair. Zahara's heart raced, and her breath hitched as he pushed her toward the fresh grave he'd started digging earlier. The shovel, rusted and cruel, lay at the edge of the pit like a witness to the cruelty he was about to commit. You think you're better than me, don't you? Keen spat, his grip tightening as he dragged her closer to the hole in the ground. You think because you can speak back to me that you're somehow special. Well, you're not. You're nothing. Just another black woman who thinks she deserves respect. His words stung more than the physical pain. But Zahara refused to let them break her. Her family had been here long before Keen's ancestors, long before he'd been born. This land was hers, and it always would be. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice low but unshakable. I've survived worse than you. Keen stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, something flickered behind them, something that felt like doubt. But it didn't last. His grin returned, wider than ever, as he shoved her toward the pit, his hands almost shaking with excitement. You will be, he snarled. You'll be afraid of the dirt, Monroe. Afraid of what's coming. Zahara's mind raced. She couldn't let him bury her alive. She couldn't let him erase her. Just as Keen bent to grab the shovel, a sound pierced the air, a sharp, echoing crunch of gravel underfoot. Zahara's heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in the silence of their house when Elijah had come home from missions, boots heavy with the weight of the world. And now, it was here. Keen froze, his hand halting midair as he turned toward the noise. For a brief second, he looked confused, an expression Zahara had never expected to see on his face. That second was all she needed. With everything she had left, Zahara pushed herself forward, breaking free from Keen's grasp, her hands bracing against the dirt as she rolled into the ground. The world spun as her body hit the earth, her arms trembling from the effort. Keen turned back to her, eyes wide in fury. But it didn't matter anymore. Because Elijah was here. And in that moment, Zahara knew, no matter what happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. The sound of Elijah's boots against the gravel grew louder, and with it, the sudden shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Zahara's heart pounded, but it wasn't fear that gripped her now. It was relief. Keen turned just as Elijah came into view, his dark eyes locked onto the deputy like a predator stalking its prey. There was no hesitation in Elijah's movements, no confusion or fear. He was focused, determined, his entire presence exuded the calm, lethal confidence of a man who had faced darkness before and was ready to face it again. "Get away from her," Elijah's voice rang out, low but powerful, and it was enough to send a shiver down Keen's spine. For the first time, the deputy's sneer faltered. His hand tightened on the shovel, but he didn't move toward Zahara. Elijah's gaze never left Keen, his posture unflinching. The tension between the two men crackled in the air, thick with unspoken history. Elijah didn't need to say more. Keen understood. He had crossed a line. And Elijah was here to draw the final boundary. "You really think you can bury her?" Elijah asked, his voice steady, unbroken. "You think this is where it ends? With her in the ground and you getting away with it?" Keen's jaw clenched, but his eyes darted around, looking for any escape. There was none. Elijah was the storm now, and Keen was caught in its path. The deputy's arrogance was still there, but the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. "You should have stayed out of this, Monroe," Keen spat, his hands still gripping the shovel like a lifeline. "This town's not big enough for the both of us." Zahara watched Elijah, her heart swelling with a mixture of awe and gratitude. There was no fear in his eyes, just a quiet strength that made her believe, deep down, they would make it out of this. Together. "You think I care about this town?" Elijah's voice rose slightly, the words sharp as knives. "I care about one thing. I care about justice. And I'm not going to let a coward like you bury the truth." Zahara's fingers trembled as she pulled herself up from the dirt. She could see it now, the anger in Elijah's eyes, burning through the years of pain and loss. He wasn't just here for her. He was here for all the names that had been buried, for the lives that had been stolen. And Keen? Keen was just the beginning. Keen's hands shook as he lifted the shovel, his eyes wild with desperation. He swung it down at Elijah, but the movement was clumsy, fueled more by panic than power. Elijah sidestepped, effortlessly avoiding the strike. Without warning, he grabbed Keen's arm, twisting it with precision, forcing the shovel from his grip. "You're not in control here anymore, deputy," Elijah said, his voice a growl. "This ends now." Zahara could see the panic in Keen's eyes, the realization that he was no longer the one calling the shots. His body stiffened, and for a moment, he was nothing more than a broken man standing before the man who had hunted him down. Elijah's eyes never wavered as he shoved Keen against a nearby tree, the sound of his head hitting the bark sharp and final. "You will never lay a hand on her again," Elijah said, his voice cold as steel. "I'm done with your kind, and so is she." For a second, Keen seemed to shrink, his bravado faltering, but then, like a snake, he lunged forward with a growl. His hands wrapped around Elijah's neck in a desperate move to regain control. But Elijah was faster. In one swift motion, he wrenched Keen's arms away and slammed him to the ground, his knee pressing into the deputy's chest. The fight was over before it truly began. Zahara wheeled herself over, the weight of everything they'd just survived settling heavily on her. She watched as Elijah stood over Keen, his fists clenched, his body taut with the effort of holding back the rage that wanted to boil over. Keen gasped, his face turning red, but there was no escape now. Elijah had him. And Elijah wasn't going to let him go. "You're going to rot in a cell for what you've done," Elijah said, his voice a whisper of cold fury. "And when you're there, you'll know the truth. You'll know that the monsters you thought you could bury, they're still here. And they're coming for you." Keen, his face twisted in a grimace of pain and fear, opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There were no more words, no more lies. The only thing left now was the sound of Elijah's breathing, steady and unbroken, as he called for the authorities. Zahara's heart raced as she watched him, her mind still processing what had just happened. Her body was battered, bruised, but her spirit had never felt stronger. Elijah had come for her, and in doing so, he had come for every other woman whose name had been buried by the hands of men like Keen. As Elijah turned toward her, his eyes softening with relief, Zahara finally allowed herself to breathe. She had survived. And so had he. But this was just the beginning. "Let's go home," Elijah said quietly, his voice full of the promise of things to come. And in that moment, Zahara knew the truth: they were unstoppable, and no one could bury them now. The drive back to their small, nondescript house felt surreal, like they were living someone else's life. Zahara sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of everything that had happened still pressing down on her. Her body ached, every part of her still feeling the sting of what Keen had done. But her mind was racing. The moment she thought she was safe, she had been thrown into the storm again. And yet, in the end, the storm had passed. Elijah's hands gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. He had always been a man of few words, but today, even the silence between them felt heavy with unspoken things. "Are you okay?" Zahara finally asked, breaking the silence, her voice soft but steady. Elijah's eyes flicked toward her for a second, a fleeting look that was both distant and filled with something deeper, concern, maybe, or guilt. He didn't answer right away, his fingers drumming lightly against the wheel as the miles passed by in a blur. "I'm fine," he said at last, his voice gruff, but it was the kind of fine that wasn't really fine at all. "I should have been there sooner." Zahara shook her head, the gentle sway of her wheelchair causing a slight jostle. "You were there exactly when you needed to be. You saved me. You always do." Elijah's lips twisted in a half-smile, the weight of his worry still lingering. "I'll never stop trying to keep you safe," he muttered. "But this town, this place, it's more than I thought. It's worse than I ever imagined." Zahara looked out the window, watching the familiar landscape of Windsor Creek slip by. The same town where she had grown up, where her family's roots ran deep. But now it felt foreign. It felt like it was suffocating her. "I know," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. "But we're still here. And now, people are starting to see it. The truth. They can't keep hiding it anymore." Elijah didn't respond right away, but Zahara could feel the tension in the air. She knew he wasn't done processing, that his mind was still fighting through the whirlwind of everything that had happened. The confrontation with Keen, the conspiracy, the militia, the lies that had been buried for so long. Elijah began, his voice faltering for the first time, as if the weight of it all was finally catching up with him. "I'm tired of this fight. Tired of playing the game, of waiting for the next blow to fall." Zahara could feel his pain, his exhaustion. She understood it more than anyone else could. But the one thing she knew for sure was that they couldn't give up now. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on him. "We never have to carry this alone. This fight, this town, this is our fight now. And we're going to keep pushing. We'll find the truth. We'll make them listen." Elijah glanced at her, the lines of weariness softening in his expression. "We can't do it alone, Zahara," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "We need more than just the two of us." Zahara nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken words. It was bigger than just them. There was an entire system of corruption, a web of lies that stretched far beyond Keen or even the militia. And though they had taken the first step toward exposing it, there was so much more to uncover. "But we've started," she replied softly. "And we're not backing down. Not now." As they pulled into the driveway, Zahara's gaze lifted to their house. It was small, modest, nothing like the mansions that dotted the wealthier parts of town, but it was home. It had always been home. The same walls that had held their love and their struggles for years, and the same walls that now felt like the last refuge in a town gone wrong. Elijah parked the car and turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "We have work to do. I'll make sure the right people hear our story. And we'll keep fighting until the truth comes out." Zahara gave him a small, tired smile. "We will," she said, her voice full of conviction. "We'll make sure they never bury the truth again." The door to their house creaked open, and the warm, familiar scent of their home surrounded them. Elijah reached out to help her out of the car, his hands gentle but firm as he guided her. They stepped inside, and for a moment, there was peace, something fleeting, but real. But as Zahara wheeled herself into the living room, she saw the first signs of what was coming. The news on the TV, a breaking story about the violence at the park, the accusations flying, and the murmurs of a town at war with itself. The fight had just begun. And the storm that Elijah and Zahara had been through was nothing compared to what was coming. "We can't stop," Zahara said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they'd just witnessed. "Not now. Not when it's this close." Elijah nodded, his expression unreadable as he walked over to the desk, his hands already reaching for the papers and files that would lead them forward. "No," he replied, a quiet fire building behind his words. "We keep going. We expose them all. One by one. And together, as a team, they would burn through the lies, the secrets, the systems built on blood. Because no matter what the wolves thought, they were not the ones in charge anymore. It was their turn now." The morning light came in slow, painting the walls of the Monroe house with a soft, amber glow. Zahara sat by the window, her eyes scanning the world outside, still silent and unaware of the storm that was building beneath the surface. It had been a long night, full of whispers, planning, and quiet moments of shared strength, but today, everything was about to change. Elijah had been up before the sun, organizing the files they had recovered from the evidence room, preparing for the next step in their fight. He had always been methodical, but now there was an edge to his movements, something sharper in his eyes. Zahara could feel the urgency in him, in everything he did. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore, he was fighting for something bigger, for the truth to finally be seen. She knew what it cost him, this battle. She saw the lines of exhaustion under his eyes, the tightness in his shoulders, the tension that had built in him over the years of fighting silent wars. But he never let it show, never let it weaken him. Not in front of her. And that was the part of him she loved the most. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a knock at the door. She turned, her hand resting on the armrest of her wheelchair, a small frown crossing her face. Elijah was already up and moving, his footsteps quick and purposeful. "I'll get it," he said, his voice steady as he moved toward the door, his gaze still focused on the papers in his hands. Zahara didn't need to ask, she knew something was coming. The door creaked open, and Zahara could hear voices, low and serious. She wheeled herself over to the hallway, careful not to make a sound. She wanted to hear what was happening, what was being said. "I'm here to help," a voice said, one she didn't recognize. It was a woman's voice, firm but tinged with uncertainty. "Elijah, we need to talk." Zahara's heart skipped a beat. She knew what this was about. This wasn't just a conversation. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that would shake this town to its core. Elijah stepped aside, and Zahara could hear the woman walking into the living room. She turned the corner to find a woman standing in their living room. She was in her mid-40s, with dark eyes that held a fierce determination. Her clothes were simple, practical, nothing that screamed authority, but there was something about her that felt like strength wrapped in quiet confidence. Zahara could tell right away that this woman wasn't here for small talk. "Elijah," the woman said again, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Zahara. "And this must be Zahara." Zahara's gaze met hers, and for a moment, she felt a ripple of recognition, though she couldn't place it. "You've heard about us?" Zahara asked, her voice steady but curious. The woman nodded, her eyes sharp. "I've been following your story. I've heard enough. And I know that if we don't act quickly, this whole town will burn itself down before anyone can stop it." Elijah stepped forward then, his face unreadable as he took a seat across from the woman. "What's your angle?" he asked, his voice calm but cautious. The woman sighed and took a seat, looking back at him. "I'm here because I believe in the truth. I work with the feds, but I don't have time for the usual politics. This town, this whole system, it's rotten to its core. I've seen the files, the reports. Everything you've uncovered is just the tip of the iceberg. The problem is, no one believes you." Zahara felt a surge of frustration. "They'll believe me once we get the truth out," she said, her voice unwavering. The woman nodded, but there was something in her expression that suggested she understood the deeper pain behind those words. "That's what I'm here for. I want to help you get it out. But it's not going to be easy. We've got some powerful people covering things up, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure this stays buried." Zahara's heart beat faster. She knew this was coming. She had always known that the truth wasn't going to come easily, but now, with someone like this woman on their side, maybe, just maybe, there was hope. "Who are we dealing with?" Elijah asked, his voice low, like a man preparing for war. The woman leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her as she glanced from Elijah to Zahara. "The wolves go deeper than you think. It's not just Keen or the militia. There are people in law enforcement, in the courthouse, even in the town council who have been feeding this corruption. It's organized, systemic. It's not just about power. It's about control. And right now, they're trying to make sure you stay quiet. But I think I can help you expose them." Zahara's eyes narrowed, her mind working through the possibilities. "And you're willing to risk everything to help us?" The woman's gaze softened for a moment, and there was a trace of something personal in her eyes. "I've been where you are, Zahara. I've seen what happens when people stay quiet. I lost someone I loved to this system. I don't want to see it happen to anyone else." Zahara nodded slowly. She understood. She understood all too well. "What do we need to do?" Elijah asked, his voice filled with resolve. The woman's expression hardened, and she leaned forward, her hands pressing firmly against the table. "We need to start by getting the right people on our side. But first, we need proof, hard, irrefutable evidence. The kind that even the wolves can't bury." Elijah and Zahara exchanged a look, both of them realizing the weight of what was being asked of them. They were about to go even deeper into the darkness of Windsor Creek, and this time, they couldn't go alone. "We'll do whatever it takes," Zahara said, her voice steady, filled with a quiet fire. "We won't let them bury the truth again." And with that, they knew, the fight was far from over. But now, they had an ally. And together, they were ready to bring the light to the darkness that had haunted this town for far too long. The day moved slower than usual, the weight of the decision they'd made heavy in the air. Zahara and Elijah sat side by side in the dim-lit living room, the papers from the evidence room spread out before them, a chaotic reminder of just how deep the corruption ran. They had barely exchanged a word since the woman, Agent Palmer, left, but the quiet between them was comfortable. It was the kind of silence they had learned to live with over the years. The silence that came before the storm. Zahara's fingers lightly traced the edges of the papers, each one filled with names, dates, and faces, each one a victim buried beneath the lies of Windsor Creek. She couldn't help but feel the weight of their stories pressing down on her, every file a reminder of the suffering the town had ignored for far too long. "They can't hide it much longer," Elijah said, his voice breaking the silence. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, the lines on his face deepening as the gravity of the situation hit him full force. "But we have to be careful. If we move too fast, if we make one wrong move, we might tip our hand too soon." Zahara looked up at him, meeting his tired gaze. She knew what he meant. They had seen the way the system worked, the way corruption wormed its way into every corner of their lives. This wasn't just about exposing one man, one group, or one town. This was about dismantling a system that had been in place for years, if not decades. And it wouldn't go down without a fight. "We can't wait any longer," she said, her voice firm. People are dying. Families are still missing. We have the evidence. We can't keep hiding it, Elijah. We have to do something now. Elijah exhaled deeply, looking at the evidence in front of them. The weight of the files was almost unbearable. The names and faces blurred together, the lines between justice and vengeance becoming harder to see. But he knew Zahara was right. If they didn't act, if they didn't push forward, all of this would be for nothing. We need to start spreading the word, Elijah said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the door, as if expecting someone to walk through it at any moment. We need to get the right people involved. People who have nothing to lose. People who aren't afraid of the wolves. Zahara nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. I'll reach out to the families. They need to know that they aren't alone. They need to see that we're not just fighting for us. We're fighting for everyone who's ever been buried by this town. As the hours passed, the plan began to take shape. The first step was simple: build a network of those who were willing to stand with them. Zahara would make the calls, contacting the families of the missing, those who had lost loved ones to the lies and the violence of Windsor Creek. Elijah would focus on gathering more evidence, making sure that the right people saw it, people who could make a difference. But as they worked, Zahara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had been in the fight long enough to recognize the warning signs. There was a shift in the air, something that felt like the calm before the storm. They were being watched. She could feel it in her bones. The wolves knew they were getting closer, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. I don't like this, she said suddenly, her voice low, her eyes darting to the window. We're being followed. Elijah stood quickly, his hand already on the holster of his gun. He didn't ask questions. He knew Zahara's instincts were sharp, honed from years of surviving in a world that wanted to silence her. Stay here, he said, his voice cold and calm. I'll check it out. But Zahara wasn't about to sit back and let him handle this alone. No, she said, her voice firm. We're in this together. I'm not going to let you go off on your own. Elijah met her gaze for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between them. He nodded, and together, they moved to the door, their steps synchronized, their bodies tense with the anticipation of what lay ahead. They slipped outside into the yard, the evening air thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint rustle of leaves. The sun had set, and the shadows around them were long, stretching across the grass like fingers reaching out for them. The street lights were dim, casting an eerie glow over the empty road. But something about the quiet didn't sit right. As they moved cautiously toward the back of the house, Zahara's heart beat faster. She couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was coming. She knew it. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw the movement, a figure darting between the trees, disappearing into the night. Elijah's hand went to his gun again, but Zahara grabbed his arm, stopping him. Wait, she whispered, her eyes narrowing in the darkness. They want us to follow. They want us to come after them. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the shadows. He knew Zahara was right. The wolves were playing a game, trying to lure them into a trap. But they couldn't afford to back down now. They had come too far. We're not going anywhere, Elijah said quietly, his voice laced with determination. We wait. We let them come to us. And so, they did. They stood there in the dark, waiting. For what, they didn't know. But they knew this fight was far from over. And whatever happened next, they would face it together. As the hours passed, the silence between them grew heavier. The air seemed to hum with anticipation, the quiet only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The wolves were out there, watching, waiting. And soon, they would make their move. The night dragged on, and with each passing minute, the weight of the quiet grew heavier. Zahara's eyes scanned the shadows, every movement in the trees setting her nerves on edge. Elijah stood next to her, still as a statue, his gaze trained on the distance. He didn't speak, but Zahara could feel the tension in his body, the same unease she was trying to suppress. The wolves were out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for them to make a mistake. "We can't keep standing here forever," Zahara whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves. Her mind was racing, trying to anticipate what they were up against. "They're waiting for us to move." Elijah didn't reply right away. His focus was absolute, his body a coiled spring, ready to snap into action at any moment. He knew Zahara was right. The waiting game was dangerous, but they had no choice but to play it. They couldn't risk walking straight into a trap. Not when they had so much to lose. Finally, after what felt like hours, Elijah spoke, his voice low and controlled. "We move now. But we stick together. No one gets left behind." Zahara nodded, her fingers tightening around the wheels of her chair. She had always been independent, but she wasn't about to argue with Elijah's plan. She trusted him with her life, and she knew he was doing everything he could to keep her safe. They made their way toward the front yard, their movements deliberate, calculated. The quiet seemed almost unnatural now, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Zahara's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let the fear take hold. This wasn't the first time she'd been in danger, and it wouldn't be the last. The difference now was that she wasn't alone. Elijah was with her, and that made all the difference. Suddenly, a crack in the distance, a sharp, unmistakable sound of a branch snapping underfoot. Zahara's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't imagining it. They were here. Elijah's hand shot out to stop her, his expression sharp. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice tight with the adrenaline rushing through him. He reached for the gun at his side, checking its chamber before slipping it into his hand. Zahara didn't hesitate. She wheeled herself closer to him, her eyes scanning every corner of the yard. The shadows around them seemed to grow longer, the night darker, as if the very earth itself was conspiring against them. And then, there it was again. A rustling in the bushes, closer this time. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Zahara's stomach clenched. The wolves had found them. But this wasn't just any man. It was Keen. Zahara's breath caught in her throat, her body going rigid with both anger and disbelief. She thought she'd seen the last of him, that he'd been dealt with. But here he was, standing in front of them, his eyes filled with cold malice. "Well, well, well," Keen said, his voice mocking, yet there was something more sinister underneath. "Look who decided to show up." Elijah moved quickly, positioning himself between Zahara and Keen. "You shouldn't be here, Keen," he said, his voice a low growl, the tension in his posture telling Zahara everything she needed to know. This wasn't a confrontation Elijah had planned for, but it was one he was ready for. Keen's lips curled into a smile, but it was empty, cold. "You really think you can get rid of me that easily?" He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel beneath his feet. "You're both more trouble than you're worth." Zahara's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what Keen was capable of, and she knew this wasn't just some random encounter. He had come for them. He had come to finish what he started. "Leave," Elijah commanded, his voice flat but filled with authority. "You don't want this fight." Keen only laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that grated on Zahara's nerves. "Oh, I think I do," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You and your wife think you can change this town, think you can expose what's been buried for so long? You're out of your depth. You have no idea what you're up against." Zahara felt a surge of anger flood through her. She was done with running. She was done being afraid. Keen had buried her once. He had tried to break her. But she wasn't going to let him do it again. "You're the one who doesn't know what you're up against," Zahara spat, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You don't get to hide behind your badge anymore. You're finished." Keen's eyes flickered with something close to rage, but before he could respond, the sound of distant sirens cut through the night. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. Elijah's eyes snapped toward the road, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. "They're here," he muttered under his breath. Keen's face twisted in fury, but there was a hint of panic in his eyes. He took a step back, his hand darting to his side, where he clearly kept a weapon. But before he could draw it, Elijah was already moving. In a blur of motion, Elijah lunged forward, knocking Keen's arm aside and sending him sprawling to the ground. The deputy struggled to get up, but Elijah was already on top of him, pressing him back down. "You're done, Keen," Elijah growled, his voice low and filled with menace. "You're going to rot for what you've done." The sirens were growing louder now, and Keen's eyes darted frantically toward the road. He knew the end was near. The wolves were losing their grip. "You think you've won?" Keen hissed, his face twisted with rage. "You think the law is going to save you? This town's not just full of crooked cops. It's full of people who've been feeding off your kind for years. You expose me? You expose all of us." Zahara's heart raced as she looked from Keen to Elijah. She knew this was just the beginning. Keen wasn't the only one who needed to be stopped. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Zahara said, her voice steady and unwavering. Elijah held Keen down for a moment longer before standing up, pulling the deputy to his feet. The sound of approaching footsteps signaled the arrival of the authorities, real ones this time. Zahara felt a wave of relief wash over her. They were not alone anymore. Keen, the wolves, and their corruption would finally be exposed for the world to see. This town, for all its secrets, would never be the same again. And neither would they. Elijah looked at Zahara, his face softening for the first time that night. "We did it," he said, his voice full of quiet pride. She nodded, her gaze never leaving Keen. "No. We haven't done it yet. But we're getting there." And she knew, deep in her bones, that this fight was far from over. The light of the early morning crept through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Zahara sat in the kitchen, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee, but the warmth of the drink did little to settle the unease in her chest. Elijah was out front, speaking to the agents who had arrived just in time to take Keen into custody. Zahara could hear their voices, but the words felt distant, muffled, as if the reality of what had just happened was too overwhelming to process all at once. The sirens had brought the cavalry, but it wasn't just the law that had arrived. It was the truth. And Zahara knew that truth would change everything. It had to. For too long, they had been fighting shadows, voices in the dark. But now, the light was breaking through. And it was only a matter of time before the rest of the town saw what they had been blind to for so long. She looked out the window at the agents, their dark suits moving with purpose as they escorted Keen to the back of a black SUV, his hands cuffed and his head hung low. He had fought back, tried to resist, but it hadn't mattered. He was broken now. The system he had helped build had turned on him. And that, Zahara thought with quiet satisfaction, was only the beginning. But even as Keen was driven away, there was a nagging feeling that clung to her, a sense that this wasn't the end, just another beginning. There were others like him. Others who had played their part in the dark web of corruption that had held Windsor Creek in its grip for so long. Keen was just the first of many, but Zahara knew they would need more than just a few arrests to bring this town to its knees. She stood up, the weight of the decision she had made settling deeper into her bones. Elijah had done what he always did, he fought, he protected, he stood firm. But now, Zahara knew it was her turn to take the lead. The truth was theirs to expose, but it would require more than just words. It would take action, strategy, and, most importantly, the courage to face what they had known all along. The door opened softly, and Elijah stepped inside, his face tired but resolute. He didn't speak immediately, but Zahara could see the storm still swirling behind his eyes. There was more to this than just Keen's capture. They both knew it. They weren't even close to winning yet. "We need to move fast," Elijah said, his voice low and urgent. "Keen's arrest is just the start, but we need to hit them harder. The longer we wait, the more they'll bury. There are still files to expose, more names to call out. And I have a feeling they're already planning their next move." Zahara nodded, her resolve hardening. She had known this was coming. The wolves didn't just disappear with a single arrest. They'd fight back, with everything they had. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. We can't let them turn this into another cover-up, she said, her voice sharp. We need to take it to the people, get the truth out there in ways they can't ignore. Elijah moved toward the table, his eyes scanning the papers spread out before them. His fingers traced the edges of the documents, his mind already working through the next steps. There's a press conference scheduled for tomorrow, he said, his voice full of quiet determination. We need to be there. We need to take the files, the evidence, everything we've uncovered, and we need to show the world. We can't let them spin the story any longer. Zahara's heart raced as she realized what he was saying. The press conference was the perfect opportunity. If they could get the media on their side, if they could expose the full extent of the corruption to the world, there would be no turning back. But it was dangerous. They were up against powerful people, people who could make this disappear in the blink of an eye. I'm in, Zahara said without hesitation. Her mind was already working, planning, strategizing. But we can't just walk in there and dump a pile of papers on the table. We need to be prepared. We need to have the right people backing us. Elijah's gaze met hers, his eyes steady. I've got some contacts who can help. We can't do this alone. Zahara felt a surge of gratitude wash over her. She knew this fight wasn't just about her or Elijah anymore. It was about the people who had been silenced for too long. It was about every family who had lost a loved one, every woman who had been buried under the weight of lies. They deserved justice. And Zahara was going to make sure they got it. We'll need backup, Zahara said, her voice resolute. We'll reach out to the families, to the community. It's time for them to see what's been happening in this town. We need to unite them. Elijah nodded, his face grim but focused. We'll make it happen. We don't stop until it's all exposed. Zahara stood up, her hands steady despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She wasn't afraid. She had faced too much in her life to be afraid now. They had come this far, and now they were closer than ever to bringing down the walls of corruption that had held this town captive for so long. The next few days would be the most dangerous yet. The wolves wouldn't go down without a fight. But this time, they weren't just hiding in the shadows. They were coming out into the light. And Zahara was ready. Ready to take this fight all the way, no matter the cost. The press conference was set for noon, but by the time the clock struck 10, Zahara and Elijah were already in the thick of preparations. They had pulled in every favor they could, reached out to every connection, and organized every bit of evidence they had. They couldn't afford any mistakes. The stakes had never been higher. Zahara sat in the back of their car, her fingers tightly gripping the handle of her wheelchair, the weight of everything bearing down on her. The silence between her and Elijah was comfortable but heavy. She could feel the tension in him, the way his jaw was clenched, his eyes scanning every corner of the street as they passed by. He had never been one to show fear, but today was different. They were about to expose something bigger than themselves. Bigger than anyone in this town. Are you sure about this? Elijah asked, his voice low as he kept his eyes on the road. Once we do this, there's no turning back. They'll know who we are, and we won't be able to hide anymore. Zahara turned her head to look at him, meeting his eyes for a brief moment before she spoke. There's nothing to hide from anymore, Elijah. The truth is out. We've been living in their shadows for too long. Today, we step into the light. Elijah nodded, though his grip on the wheel tightened slightly. You're right. But I want you to know, this won't be easy. The wolves won't go down without a fight. And if we're not careful, they'll drag us under with them. Zahara's fingers tightened on the armrests of her chair as the weight of his words settled in. She knew he was right. The truth they were about to reveal would shake Windsor Creek to its very core, but there were people who had a lot to lose, people who would do anything to silence them. But Zahara wasn't afraid of them anymore. She had faced Keen, had fought to survive in a world that constantly told her she wasn't enough. She had survived the whispers, the hate, the lies. And now, it was time for those same people to see who she was, who they both were. The car pulled up in front of the small town hall where the press conference was scheduled. The building, like much of Windsor Creek, had seen better days. But it still stood, just like Zahara and Elijah. No matter how broken, no matter how battered, they hadn't fallen yet. Zahara felt her heart race as they made their way inside, their steps echoing in the empty hallway. Elijah walked beside her, every step deliberate, every movement controlled. But she could feel the heat radiating off him, the same fire that burned in her chest, the same fire that had driven them this far. The room was small, with a single podium at the front and a handful of journalists milling about, adjusting their cameras, their notebooks, and their microphones. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmurs of the crowd just barely audible over the sound of their own footsteps. Zahara wheeled herself to the front of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The moment they had been building toward. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before she locked eyes with Elijah. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. This was their moment. And they weren't going to back down. "Good afternoon, everyone," Elijah's voice rang out, firm and steady as he stepped to the podium. Zahara remained beside him, her presence a quiet anchor as they prepared to expose everything. "We're here today because we believe in justice. We believe in truth. And we believe it's time for the people of Windsor Creek to finally know what's been happening in the shadows of this town." The room fell silent as Elijah spoke, the reporters hanging on every word. Zahara could feel the weight of their gazes on her, the silent judgment, the unspoken questions. But she held her head high, her eyes unwavering as she prepared to speak. "We've been living with this lie for far too long," Zahara continued, her voice calm but carrying the weight of everything she had lived through. "For years, we've been told to stay quiet. We've been told to stay in our place. But today, I'm telling you that it's over. No more hiding. No more pretending. The truth is coming out, and no one can stop it." She looked out over the crowd, watching the shift in their expressions. There were some who looked confused, others who were skeptical, but the one thing they all shared was curiosity. They wanted answers. And Zahara was about to give them the truth they had been waiting for. "The corruption here goes deeper than just one man," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It goes all the way to the heart of this town. There are people here who have used their power to control, to oppress, to bury the truth. And we've spent years gathering the evidence to prove it." Elijah took over from there, his tone unwavering as he outlined everything they had uncovered: Keen's involvement in the militia, the illegal deals made behind closed doors, the lives that had been lost because of the greed and cruelty that had taken root in Windsor Creek. Every word felt like a weight lifted, a truth finally spoken out loud. But then came the moment Zahara had been dreading, the moment that would change everything. "And we have the proof," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We have documents. Photos. Audio recordings. And today, we're sharing them with you." With a quick motion, Elijah placed a file on the podium and opened it, revealing photographs and documents that detailed the extent of the corruption they had uncovered. The reporters began scribbling furiously, their cameras clicking as they captured every image, every piece of evidence. But Zahara could feel the shift in the air. The tension was palpable. She knew what was coming next. The wolves were already circling. A voice from the back of the room interrupted her. "This is all just hearsay," a man shouted, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Where's your proof? Who else can back this up?" Zahara's gaze never wavered as she met the man's eyes. "The proof is right here," she said, her voice unwavering. "But you're not just going to see it in a document. You're going to see it in the people who've lived it. You're going to see it in the families who have lost everything because of this." The room went quiet, the weight of her words settling on everyone in the room. And for the first time in years, Zahara felt something shift in the air. A crack in the armor. The beginning of change. "We're not going anywhere," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "And neither is the truth." And in that moment, Zahara knew that no matter how hard they tried, the wolves couldn't bury them anymore. The truth was out. And it was time for the world to see it.